said, certified sheep. Yeah, Eve still sleep. Thinking cast on, cause this is the go deep. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, you dealing with a vet, no rookie. Keep my sisters in the clutch, and we ain't no goofies. We the people of the book, and our hat is woolly. Shebrew baby, yeah, we go hard. Wanna sin, better be on guard. The Most High is in the place, and it's rap. You wanna escape? We do not die, we multiply. And our Father, He's just on high. Precepts we keep them, we do not lie. The kingdom is coming, and we gon' rise. I'm with my brothers, keep hope alive. Stay with the word, just like a scribe. I want you to keep your spirit in check. Don't you believe Satan's lies? We are a team, we keep it clean. Up in the mountain, all high in the steam. Donate me, we Nazarene. And let me tell you, I'm the daughter of a king. Follow me, hollow tree, check my autonomy. Quick in the spirit, no, you can never get to me. Pappy could have put it, it's not sponsored by me. I cut down Satan for let it even get at me. I'm that sis, keep a Bible in my grip, having sex for a car when your baby home sick. Just like my father, know I never am changed. Keep my sisters with me, I wipe everything. Now get your Bible and your coat, go in there, roll the two. You got a phone, but all alone, oh yes, you are a group. You paid your tuition, bring to a missing, need a reaper, truth. And think supreme, illuminating, shake the demons looking. Since you need a real teacher, need a life coach, you need a baptism, need a makeover. Not an evil man, serving king cobra, got a hook in you, now your face flow. You chasing money, hell's where you're headed. My spirit ain't one, you evil and deaded. Brothers got beards, don't want them to shed it. Feed your man poorly, now he diabetic. You're right here like spittle, you shove in the coat. Come in his rap, you better stay woke. I want you to get with your sister Shia. Come meet me back at the coast, prepare for the fire. No horse for hire, that bitch is death to my haters and liars. You riding the beat like the daughter of Poppy. I get on the mic and surprise everybody. Your honor, I'm a queen, I'm not with the Greek-ish. Give him on my little Betty, know I'm never cheating. Put him on the dice, it's a girl he believe in. Don't get in fights with my sisters, I'm a beat. In the Bible belt, I'm the one to meet you. Need to come to class, I'll be the one to teach you. CC stand for crystal clean, and you can see my life before I ever meet you. Sister slow to slow, cause she couldn't hang, can't hurt my feelings, and I can't sing. Got angels with me, no, you can't defeat me. When I ride the beat, I'ma spell my name. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, you dealing with a vet, no rookie. Keep my sisters in the clutch, and we ain't no goofies. We the people of the book, and our hair is willing. Now from the top, make it hot. Sisters slaying these demons. You giving all your goodies up for some money and semen. I'm talking bop, bop, bop. Dropping bombs on your lace front. Shebrews pulling all the stops. I'm get baptized at the lakefront, huh? You wanna hear it? Shalom, peace be unto everyone. Grand rising, shalom alaikum to all my people, all my family, sisters and brothers alike. It's your sister ChayaFyah here with another story time. We're still reading from yesterday when God was a woman. This is part 4. We're starting at chapter 6. I'm going to share my screen. Go ahead and jump right in. This chapter is titled, If the King Did Not Weep. Even in Neolithic and earliest historic periods, it seems that in many towns and settlements, a person may have sat upon the throne by divine right, much as the remaining monarchies of the world would claim to do even today. The major difference was that the divine right was probably provided originally not by a male god, but by the goddess. And documentary and mythological evidence suggests that this right, rather than being bestowed upon a male, was originally held by a woman, the high priestess of the goddess, who may have gained this position by the custom of matrilineal descent. In the role of high priestess of the goddess, this woman may also have been regarded as queen or tribal ruler. This was certainly the case in Kiram, where, according to Fraser, the high priestess automatically became the head of state. The juxtaposition of these two roles, that of high priestess and that of queen, is repeatedly attested to in early historic times in tablets and texts of the Near East. Many writers, perhaps using our own male-oriented society as a pattern, reverse cause and effect, suggesting that when a woman became queen, she then also gained the title of high priestess, a position supposedly resulting from her marriage to the king. But as I shall explain, evidence suggests that it was the other way around, that the highest and most sacred attendant of the female deity in the very earliest times was probably the origin of the concept of royalty. As I mentioned earlier, the temples of the goddess in Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods appear to have been the core of the community, apparently owning the land, the herds of animals, and most material property. This was the situation even in the early historic times of Inanna, the house of heaven, the temple of the goddess Inanna in Erech. A. Mortgat writes that at about 3000 BC in Uruk or Erech, modern Warka, the sacred place of Inanna, the Sumerian Lady of Heaven, there arose a complex of buildings which even today would be numbered among the most splendid of architectural works, were they in a better state of preservation. Professor Albright goes on to explain the discoveries in Erech in Babylonia have proved that the temple complex at Inanna was already before 3000 BC the center of an elaborate economic organization. According to Sidney Smith, professor of Near Eastern archaeology in Sumer, the temple directed every essential activity, not only matters that might be considered religious business, but the urban activities of the craftsmen, the traders, and the rural employment of farmers, shepherds, poultry keepers, fishermen, and fruit gardeners. In Neolithic and earliest historic times, the Entu, the name of the high priestess in Sumer, the Tawawanas, the name of the high priestess in Anatolia, and their counterparts in other areas would probably have been the nominal leaders of those temple communities. The priestly office of divine lady, one of the gifts Enki complained had been taken by Inanna from Eridu to Erech, may have referred to just such a position. But nominal leader does not infer monarchy. In fact, several documents and myths suggest that Neolithic and early historic goddess worshiping communities were governed by assemblies, probably composed of the elders of the community. One Mesopotamian tablet said that under the guidance of Inanna at Agade, is old women and its old men gave wise counsel. Eldership was another of the gifts of civilization that Inanna gave to Erech. Gurney writes that before the arrival of the Hittites, the Hattans had originally been loosely organized in a number of independent townships, each governed by a body of elders. Even in Hittite times, texts describe a group known as the elderly women, who held prophetic and advisory positions and were also associated with mental and physical healing. Professor Thorkild Jacobson of the University of Chicago has influenced many other archaeologists and historians on this subject. His theory, based on the fact that the earliest Sumerian myths included both female and male deities in the decision-making assemblies of heaven, suggests that such participation of women in leadership was very likely a reflection of the societies that wrote the legends, both women and men taking part in community government. We may even regard the concept of monotheism, so often presented as a more civilized or sophisticated type of religion, as reflecting the political ideology that places all power in a single dominant person, while polytheism, especially as represented in the image of divine assemblies, perhaps symbolized a more communal attitude in the societies that developed and followed this type of theological thought. There is no definitive evidence of the relationship between the role of high priestess and these group of elders, though under the guidance of inanna may refer to the role played by her high priestess. Judging from the mythological accounts of the goddess, with the high priestess understood to be her incarnation upon earth. We are presented with the image not of a celibate woman, nor of one who took a permanent husband, as queens did in historic periods, but of a woman who chose annual lovers or consorts, as she retained the more permanent position of highest rank for herself. The symbolism of her yearly youthful consorts, the dying son or lover of the goddess, occurs and recurs throughout the legends of the goddess religion, probably recording Neolithic and earliest historic periods. It is found in the most ancient legends of both Sumer and Egypt and survives in all historic periods of the Near East until the first centuries of Christianity, in which it may have been retained in the annual mourning for the death of Jesus. Sir James Frazer, author of The Golden Bow, explored this subject more extensively and thoroughly than any other scholar of comparative religion. Though some of his conclusions and theories have been questioned by later writers, the major body of material in his 12 extensive volumes, even today, holds a great deal of valuable information, and perhaps more pertinent, still raises some interesting points. The subject of the annual death of the son or lover of the goddess interests us here because it appears to be a direct outgrowth of the original rituals and customs of the early female religion. It symbolizes one of the most ancient practices recorded, the ritual sacrifice of an annual king, consort of the high priestess. Several accounts of tribes in Africa describe queens who remained unmarried while taking lovers of lesser rank. Records from Nigeria report that a male was the consort of the queen until she found herself pregnant, at which time he was strangled by a group of women. He had fulfilled his earthly task. Sounds like the praying mantis. Numerous accounts, legends, and fragments of text and prayers suggest that there were similar practices in most of the goddess worshiping cultures throughout the Near East. Slightly different adaptations depending on the location and the gradual transitions that took place over the years. It is pointless to make any firm generalization on what was done or why, since the information in each specific culture would not support such an overall statement. Yet there are pieces of evidence everywhere that suggest that in Neolithic and perhaps even the earliest historic periods, the consort of the high priestess met a violent death while she remained to grieve. The material is derived from 3 separate lines of evidence. The first includes the accounts of the actual ceremonies, which describe the marriage of the consort to the priestess, providing him with the position later defined as kingship. The second, the documents of rituals, which in historic times came to be used as a substitute for the original sacrifice. Human substitutes, assault, effigies, and animal sacrifice. The third, the most detailed descriptions are provided by the legends, which probably accompanied these substitute rituals, these at the proper ceremonial moment, offering the theological explanation of the symbolic action taken. This material suggests that the high priestess, as the incarnation of the goddess, chose a lover probably much younger than herself, since he was so often referred to as the son of the goddess. Numerous accounts tell of the sexual union that took place between them, often referred to as the hieros gamos, or the sacred marriage. This sacred marriage or sexual union is attested to in the historic periods of Sumer, Egypt, Babylon, and even in classical Greece. After the sexual ceremony, the young man assumed the role as consort of the priestess. He was the king. The inference that seems indisputable, writes Professor S. Smith, is that the rite of the sacred marriage goes back to a remote antiquity, and that is the reason why it is included in the cults of distinctly different gods. Its annual nature seems to be connected with the annual reappointment of the king. Describing the status of the male who related to the high priestess in the Aegean Butterworth tells us that access to the divine was through the queen. The sacred sexual union with the high priestess gave the male consort a privileged position. According to Professor Saggs in Historic Sumer and Babylon, after the sacred marriage, the goddess fixed the destiny of the king for the coming year. But in earlier days, this position of kingship was far from permanent. The male chosen held his royal rights for a specific period of time. At the end of this time, perhaps a year, since the ceremony was celebrated annually, but other records seem to suggest possibly a longer period in certain areas, this youth was then ritually sacrificed. In 1914, Stephen Langdon wrote that the divine figures of Tammuz, Adonis, and Osiris represent a theological principle, the incarnation of religious ideas which were once illustrated in a more tangible form. Not the divine son who perished in the waves, but a human king who was slain. In 1952, Charles Seltman of the University of Cambridge described the situation in this way. The great goddess was always supreme, and the many names by which she was called were but a variety of titles given to her in diverse places. She had no regular husband, but her mate, her young lover, died or was killed every autumn and was glorified in resurrection every spring, coming back to the goddess, even as a new gallant may have been taken into favor every year to mate with an earthly queen. In 1957, Robert Graves wrote of the ritual regicide as it appeared in pre-Indo-European Greece, explaining it as follows. The tribal nymph, it seems, chose an annual lover from her entourage of young men, a king to be sacrificed when the year ended. The sacred king continued to hold his position only by the right of marriage to the tribal nymph. In his introduction to the Greek myths, he explains his theories on how kingship in the Aegean was made a permanent institution, as a gradual extension of the year into a longer year was introduced by the invading Indo-European Achaeans of the 13th century BC, and later a permanent kingship instituted by the Indo-European Dorians at about 1100 BC. Both Fraser and James offer the Shilluk groups of the Upper Nile as a possible analogy. Professor James, writing in 1937, says, "It was the custom in this tribe until recently to put the king to death whenever he showed signs of failing health and virility. Therefore, as soon as he was unable to satisfy the sexual passions of his wives, it was their duty to acquaint the elders with the fact, and arrangements were made at once for his demise and the appointment of a vigorous successor to reign in his stead." Fraser listed Canaan, Cyprus, and Carthage as places where in earliest historic times there was the most certain evidence of the slaying of the king. Fraser, Langdon, James, Seltman, Graves, and many others agreed that the legend was enacted and that the male who was slain was the temporary king of the city, the youth who had previously played the role of the son or lover in the sacred sexual union. Most authors who discuss the sacrifice of the king describe it primarily as a fertility rite, suggesting that his remains may even have been scattered over the newly sown fields. Though this perhaps became the custom in later periods, one of the earliest recorded legends, that of the Sumerian goddess Inanna, written shortly after 2000 BC,
probably a written record of even earlier myths and religious ideas, presented a different motive. In this legend, the sacrifice of the consort occurred when he was no longer willing to defer to the wishes, commands, and power of the goddess. This most ancient account perhaps reveals the earliest origins and reasons for the death of the male consort. Later ideas of fertility or expiation of sins may have eventually been embroidered about the custom to ensure or explain its continuation. The generally accepted explanation of the sacrifice of the king as a fertility rite was probably a result of the fact that all legends available until recently told only of the grief of the goddess over the death of her son or lover. It was only upon the discovery and decipherment of the last fragments of the Sumerian legend, which added the information that, although Inanna did grieve at the death, it had occurred as a result of her own wrath at the youth's arrogance, that we are now in a position to question the actual meaning and reasons for this ancient ritual and revise those generally accepted explanations. It may be helpful to examine the numerous accounts of the sacred marriage, or the son or lover as king, and the position of the high priestess in several of the cultures of the Near East, to gain a deeper comprehension of the custom as it may have originally been known, by learning of its various adaptations in the historical periods following the Indo-European invasions. In the Sumerian accounts of Inanna and Dumuzi, defined as the true son, we learn that after he proved himself upon her bed, she then arranged his future for him, making him shepherd of the land. Though this may symbolically sound like a very important post, we should remember that there were huge herds of animals owned and kept by the staff of the temples, and the title may originally have been a description of his actual role. The son/lover as shepherd appears in many versions of the tale in various areas and epochs, and once again suggests the relationship of the original son/lover to the later worship of Jesus. But whatever the actual nature of the position, the Sumerian legend tells us that when Inanna was looking for a replacement for herself in the land of the dead, she passed over her own servant because he had been most loyal and served her well. She passed over a minor god because he had bowed down to her as she requested. But eventually she chose her own son, her own lover, Dumuzi, who had dared to climb joyfully upon her throne during her absence and had behaved in a most arrogant manner upon her return. The death of the earliest Sumerian Dumuzi was not an accident. He died at Inanna's command. Sumerian documents reveal that the origins of kingship in Sumer began with the position of In, defined as both priest and consort of the goddess. Inship was later replaced by Insiship, which appears to have provided greater and more secular powers. The office of Insi was then supplanted by the title and position known as Lugal, which literally means important man, but is usually translated as king. Another most ancient word, Mukarib, is also often translated as king, though it literally means bringer of offerings. Saggs explains that the Insi was originally elected probably in time of war, but near the end of the third millennium, this position became hereditary. Professor Sidney Smith comments that the documents that describe the extensive use of oracular divination and prophecy reveal that even after the role of king became more permanent, no king acted according to his own judgment alone. The position as leader seems to have been instituted in a period remembered by the time written records appear. In the early second millennium legend of Inanna, we read, "At that time, no tiara had been worn. There was at first no royal direction of the people of the goddess. Kingship then came down from heaven. But this kingship, as suggested by the accounts of the arrival of the Ubaid and Shemsu Hor peoples of Sumer and Egypt, more likely arrived by sailboat than by spaceship." Professor S.N. Kramer, eminent Sumeriologist, tells us that in the historical periods of Sumer, the most significant rite of the new year was the Hieros Gamos, or holy marriage between the king, who represented the god Tammuz, and one of the priestesses, who represented the goddess Inanna. The idea arose that the king of Sumer, no matter who he was or from what city he originated, must become the husband of the life-giving goddess of love, that is, Inanna of Erech. The kings of Sumer are known as the beloved husbands of Inanna through the Sumerian documents from the time of Enmerkar, about 2600 BC, down to the post-Sumerian days, since they seem to have been mystically identified with Tammuz. Professor Kramer describes the role of the priestess of Inanna as that of the dominant partner, explaining that she makes him king, not the other way about, that she brings her lover to her own house, and that she is asked as the queen of heaven to allow him to enjoy long days at her holy lap. Professor Henry Frankfurt also pointed out that in the sacred marriage, the dependence of the god upon the goddess is strongly emphasized. Texts from Ison leave no doubt that the initiative was ascribed to her. All the kings of Isin, a city of Sumer that flourished between 2000 and 1800 BC, spoke of themselves as the beloved consort of Nana. Tablets from the reign of Shusen, about 1980 BC, also suggest the more aggressive role of Inanna at the sacred marriage. Her part reads, "Bridegroom, let me caress you. My precious caress is more savory than honey. In the bedchamber, let us enjoy your goodly beauty." All right. When Enmerkar, an in Erech, battled with the king of Arada, Enmerkar won. The king of Arada then said to him, "You are the beloved of Inanna. You alone are exalted. Inanna has truly chosen you for her holy lap." Another tablet tells us to Enatum, the Ensi of Lagash, about 2200 BC, Inanna, because she loved him, gave the kingship of Kish in addition to the inciship of Lagash. Text of Shogi, a king of the third dynasty of about 2040 BC, read, Goddess, I will perform for you the rites which constitute my royalty. I will accomplish for you the divine pattern. In these same tablets, which appear to be the written dialogue for the roles for the sacred ceremonial drama of the Hyros Gamos, the high priestess of Inanna then says of Shogi, when he has made love to me on the bed, then I in turn shall show my love for the Lord. I shall make for him a good destiny. I shall make him shepherd of the land. Two other names of the goddess in Sumer, each in different locations, describing her as the mother of Inanna, were also mentioned in connection with this custom. One inscription tells us of the goddess Ninmah, Lady Mother, raising Rim-Sin to kingship at about 1800 BC in Larsa. The accounts of 4 kings of Sumer recorded that the goddess known as Ninlil brought the new young king into her bower each time, presumably meaning that a sacred sexual union took place between the potential king and the high priestess of the goddess. Professor Sidney Smith writes, the records of the Ninlil festivals show that the occasions when a king of Sumer and Akkad was brought into the bower marked the establishment of different dynasties. At the beginning of the reign of Lipit Ishtar, about 1930 BC, his sister was high priestess at But when another group of people conquered this city, her name was then associated with their king. Clearly by this time, and even from the time of Enmerkar, the ancient customs were being used to justify the results of battles and military conquests. Marriage to the high priestess was being used to acquire legitimacy upon the throne in the eyes of the people. Sidney Smith writes of the exceptional political position of the priestesses. He describes the situation of Lipit Ishtar and the woman known as his sister, saying, the whole incident illustrates the political significance of these appointments. The sporadic appointment of princesses at when that city was compelled to acknowledge the rule of men, not of southern origin, was obviously due to political motives. As I explained in the previous chapter, it seems that as the followers of Enki and Enlil grew more powerful, the high priestess, as representative of the goddess, lost a great deal of her earlier prerogatives, but was probably left with the role of bestowing kingship, matrilineal customs still being honored. The actual position of the high priestess at this period is open to question. We know from the records that many of them were daughters, sisters, or mothers of the kings who were in power. The records of Hammurabi's time show that his sister was a Nadatu priestess, suggesting that the high priestess may have been connected with this group who seem to have managed the business affairs of the temples and community land. Babylon, she who holds the reins of kings. In Babylon of the 18th to the 6th centuries BC, which superseded Sumer as the major power in Mesopotamia, the goddess was known as Ishtar. She was the Akkadian version of Inanna and revered as Ishtar even in the temple of Erech. Her dying son/lover, once known in Sumer as Dumuzi, was now called Tammuz. Professor James comments on the relationship of Ishtar and Tammuz, writing, in this alliance, she was the dominant partner, as has been demonstrated, for when he was brought into close connection with Ishtar in the Tammuz myth, He was her son as well as her husband and brother, and always subordinate to her as the young god. The attributes and legends of Inanna and Ishtar are so similar that many writers speak of the goddess as Inanna or Ishtar, but there were certain variations in the legends, transitions that perhaps reflect the change in attitudes over the centuries as the result of the more continual and successful invasions of the Indo-Europeans. In hardly any Babylonian literature do we learn that Ishtar actually caused the death of Tammuz, which is reported to have happened in a variety of accidental ways. Legends generally explain that Tammuz died and Ishtar grieved. But in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, based on an earlier Sumerian saga known only from small fragments, the name of Tammuz was included in a long list of lovers whom Ishtar had in some way deeply injured. Gilgamesh, historically listed as an early in of Erech, pointedly declined the honor of becoming the husband of Ishtar and thus being added to the list. The story probably represents one of the earlier refusals of a consort or king to follow the ancient customs and the attempt to institute a more permanent and powerful kingship. His quest for immortality in the same legend may also reveal this as its underlying message. The story of Gilgamesh takes place in Sumer, but once again, we may suspect the influence or presence of the patrilineal northerners, perhaps from Arata. The name Gilgamesh may well be associated with the later Hurrian city of Carchemish, whose ancient name was Kar-Ganarsh. The story of Gilgamesh is found not only in Sumerian and Babylonian literature, but in Hurrian and Hittite texts as well. Gilgamesh is listed as an in of Erech. Therefore, he gains the role of king as consort to the high priestess. His father is listed as Lugalbanda, who, though a previous in of Erech, is also described as a shepherd and a nomad. In the very beginning of the story, we learn that Gilgamesh is oppressing Erech, taking the son from the father, taking the maiden from her lover. We next read that he is about to attend a feast at which he will fertilize the woman of destiny, suggesting his role in the sacred marriage. Another figure appears at this time. He is known as Enkidu, a wild man of the woods. Enkidu is then treated to extravagant clothing, splendid food and drink, and the company of a Quadishtu, a holy woman of the temple with whom he has his first sexual encounters. Shortly afterward, Ishtar proposes marriage to Gilgamesh, telling him that she has longingly gazed upon his beauty. But Gilgamesh, acting not in accordance with the role he is supposed to play, spurns the proposal of the goddess. In doing this, he lists all of her past lovers who have met a tragic fate, ending with, "You would love me too, and then make my fate like theirs." Among these past lovers, Tammuz is mentioned as a lover of Ishtar's younger days. The name Tamuzi actually appears twice on the Sumerian king list, once directly between Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh, and once in an even earlier period, just a few names after Alalu, first king of Sumer, at Eridu. The second, Damuzi, and Gilgamesh himself appear to be from about 2500 BC. After the marriage rejection, a fight then ensues between Ishtar, Enkidu, and Gilgamesh, in which the two men insult the goddess, kill her heavenly bull, and throw its thigh bone or genitals, depending upon the translation, in her face. Gilgamesh calls out, "If I could, I would do the same to you." As a result of this incident, Enkidu, who probably symbolizes the substitute sacrifice, is put to death. Gilgamesh is spared and at this point goes off on his search for immortality, which leads into the Sumerian account of the flood and its survivors. apart from the possible connections of the name Gilgamesh with the later human city of Karganish, the hints at the very beginning that Gilgamesh is oppressing Erech, the general plot of the story, and the existence of Hurrian and Hittite texts of the same epic, several other factors suggest that this once again reflects normal attitudes. In it, we may be witnessing a confrontation of the two cultures. In the Sumerian king list, Enmerkar directly precedes Lugalbanda, the father of Gilgamesh. Several cuneiform tablets reveal that both Enmerkar and Lugalbanda were in close touch with the land of Arada, possibly Aratu. One myth tells of Lugalbanda accompanying Enmerkar to the area, a trip brought to a halt by a rather mystical event at a place named Mount Huram. Enmerkar also had very close connections with the Enki temple at Eridu, demanding that the people of Arada send tribute there. The king who preceded Enmerkar apparently founded the first dynasty of Erech. The king lists tell us that he entered the seas and climbed the mountains, perhaps suggesting his travels before reaching Erech, possibly from the mountain lands of Arada. The account of the rebellion against Ishtar, probably as represented by the high priestess, may well have actually occurred at the time of the institution of kingship in Erech, and the story later added to the Babylonian accounts of Gilgamesh, who seems to have become something of a legend hero in many other tales as a result of his military exploits. Whenever it actually occurred, this account may symbolize an incident much like the one Diodorus Siculus reported among the Nubians of the Upper Nile. He wrote that a king who rebelled against being sacrificed murdered all the presiding clergy, thus proclaiming a permanent kingship for himself. By Babylonian times, the king was certainly no longer put to death. Yet Ishtar was still described as the one who appointed the king, she who endowed him with prestige. In one inscription, she was titled Counselor of all rulers, she who holds the reins of kings. In another, she was known as she who gives the scepter, the throne, the year of reign to all kings. Sargon of Akkad, one of the earliest kings of central Mesopotamia at about 2300 BC, wrote that his mother was a high priestess. His father was unknown. Later, he says, Ishtar came to love him, and then for years I exercised kingship. In The Childhood of Man, L. Frobenius, discussing the ritual of the sacrifice of the king, explained, already in ancient Babylon, it had been weakened inasmuch as the king at the New Year festival in the temple was only stripped of his garments, humiliated, and struck, while in the marketplace a substitute who had been ceremonially installed in all glory was delivered to death by the noose. Various accounts of the ceremonies that took place during Babylonian periods tell of the king going to the temple to be struck in the face, his clothing and royal insignia temporarily removed. Other texts tell us that his hair was shorn, his girdle removed, and in this state he was thrown into the river. When he emerged, he was made to walk about in sackcloth for several days as a symbol of mourning. Saggs observes that there is some evidence, even from the first millennium, that the king at his death may have been assimilated to the supposedly dying god Tammuz. These were symbolic reminders of the days when the consort/king would have met his death. But just as Gilgamesh continued to live while Enkidu died, the substitute lost his life as kingship in Sumer, and Babylon became a permanent and hereditary institution. There are hints of expiation of sins and atonement in these rituals. The king is being punished, but for what? It seems that eventually the chastisement came to be for the sins of the people, but did this not originate from his earlier punishment for refusing to defer to the priestess queen? The fact that good fortune was predicted if tears came to his eyes when he was struck perhaps reveals these origins. According to the Babylonian tablets, if the king does not weep when struck, the omen is bad for the year. In Egypt, Isis mourns the death of Osiris. Sagg's writing of the ritual regicide states, this latter practice certainly occurred in Egypt in prehistoric times, while some authorities argue that it survived into historical times. In the earliest records of Egypt, shortly after 3000 BC, men were sacrificed at the grave of Osiris, brother/husband of the goddess Isis. The records tell us that the sacrificed men had red hair, perhaps, as I mentioned before, a result of the invasion of the Shemsu Hor. In Egyptian theogony, Horus was the son of Isis. Upon his death, he becomes Osiris. Though it is the death of Osiris that is commemorated, it is actually Horus, the son, who has died. At the death of Osiris, the new Horus was then installed upon the throne. Thus, in the cumulative myths of Egypt, where each new idea seems to have been added and little, if anything, eliminated, both Horus and Osiris engaged in a battle against Set. But it is Osiris who is killed by Set. The stories of the death of Osiris were not only remembered and ceremonially reenacted in Egypt, but were also closely connected with Canaan, especially at the most ancient port of Byblos. Byblos, a city slightly north of Beirut in Lebanon, was an Egyptian colony or commercial seaport as early as the Second Dynasty of Egypt, which occurs at about 2850 to 2600 BC. But even as late as about AD 150, Lucian speaks of the death of the lover of the goddess, then known as Adonis, taking place at Aphaka near Byblos. Lucian then reveals that the secret rites of Adonis are actually those of Osiris. Some accounts claim that the body of Adonis was buried at Aphaka, just a few miles from Byblos, while Egyptian myth tells us that Isis brought the body back to Egypt for burial, describing in detail all the various problems she encountered doing this. In Crete, the god who usually dies shortly after his wedding. Hawks, describing the goddess and the dying youth on the island of Crete, where worship of the female deity flourished from before 3000 BC until the arrival of the Indo-European Dorians in about 1100 BC, stated, she is accompanied by a youthful male deity, a year spirit, who is her consort and offspring, who dies and is born again. The Cretan version of Adonis. In Minoan Crete, this young god was always subject to the goddess. He was the instrument of her fertility and is shown in humble and worshipful attitudes. Stalianos Alexou suggests that in Crete, the sacred marriage, the union of the goddess and the god, who usually dies shortly after his wedding, symbolizes the fertility of the earth. Even in classical times, the Indo-European Zeus was worshipped by the people of Crete as an infant and revered primarily as the son of his mother Rhea. Greek theogony tells us that the goddess Rhea hid the infant Zeus from his father in a Cretan cave. In one legend, Rhea was described as being sexually attacked by her son Zeus, possibly a remnant of an earlier account of the sacred sexual union that took place between them. On Crete, Zeus was thought of as the dying sun, a concept deeply resented by the Indo-European Greeks, of the mainland who insisted that Zeus was immortal. Northern Canaan, mistress of kingship. In the text of Ugarit of the 14th century BC, many of the accounts appear to be the result of the assimilation of the religion of the goddess with newer Indo-European concepts, possibly derived from the great number of Hurrians living there at the time. The texts tell the story of the death of Baal, lord of Mount Saphon. They record that Baal's death was a result of a battle with Mot, a name otherwise unknown, though the legends reveal that Mot was an enemy greatly feared by Baal. After his death, the goddess Anath carried Baal's body on her shoulders to find a burial place. As soon as this was done, she avenged the death of Baal by killing Mot, an event described in rather gruesome detail. But the revenge killing seems to be the reason that Baal was then allowed to re-enter the world of the living. According to the legend, he then joined Anath in a field, fell down before her in grateful appreciation, admiring her horns of strength. She taking the form of the sacred heifer, he of a bull, they united in sacred sexual union. Even at this period, Anath was still known as the mistress of the heavens, mistress of kingship. Anatolia, she who controls kingship. There are no records among the Hittite texts of Anatolia that suggest that the king was put to death, possibly because the earliest written material that has so far been found seems to have been produced by the Indo-European Hittites themselves. Yet the sun goddess of Inanna, the Hattian deity who appears to have been adopted by the invading Hittites, was still known in prayer as she who controls kingship in heaven and on earth. Texts of the Hittites describe a ritual that a queen performs in front of 8 statues of the sun goddess, each bearing the name of a previous high priestess queen. Gurney writes that the great national deity of the Hittites was the sun goddess of Inanna, who directs kinship and queenship. And it is therefore no surprise to find that her regular festivals were among those for which the presence of the king was essential. Though the evidence is scanty, it seems to point to much the same relationship between the priestess of the goddess and the king in pre-Hittite days. Possibly adopted into Hittite custom to ensure royal legitimacy, early Indo-European leaders may have at one time taken part in the sacred marriage with Hattian priestesses. After about 1000 BC, stories of the goddess then known as Sibyl and the youth, then known as the shepherd Attis, predominate in Anatolia, legends once again probably surviving from the earlier religion of the goddess people. Various versions of the death of Attis, at times associated with his castration, retell the story of the dying son/lover. An interesting factor in the accounts of Sibyl and Attis is that this version of the religion of the goddess was eventually brought from Anatolia to Rome. It was celebrated there in great processions and festivals until AD 268 and embraced by such emperors as Claudius and Augustus. We can only guess at the influence this had upon the Christian religion that was developing there at that time. Roman reports of the rituals of Sibyl record that the sun, this time as an effigy, was first tied to a tree and then buried. 3 days later, a light was said to appear in the burial tomb, whereupon Attis rose from the dead, bringing salvation with him in his rebirth. Sibyl was always closely identified with the goddess Rhea, who was known as the mother of Zeus, and it is quite possible in pre-Christian Rome that the mother of the dying god was known as Maria. Or Maria. Cyprus and Greece, the rites for the dead shepherd. On the island of Cyprus, the death of Adonis was recalled in the worship of Aphrodite. Greek tales explain that the goddess had taken a shepherd youth as a lover, having fallen in love with this youth when she first saw him as an infant. Disgusting. After living with him for a year in the wooded hills of Cyprus, according to the legend, she left to visit Corinth, one of the major centers of Aphrodite worship in classical Greece. Upon her absence, Adonis was killed by a wild boar, a description of the death which also appeared in some of the legends of Osiris and Attis. Through the worship of Aphrodite, which on the island of Cyprus was closely associated with the Canaanite Astarte, the rites for the dead shepherd youth Adonis survived in classical Greece, though frowned upon by Indo-European government officials. Israel, a dying god named Tammuz. In biblical accounts, the rituals of the death of the son/lover were once again described, this time taking place among the Hebrew women who prayed at the temple in Jerusalem in about 620 BC. In the book of Ezekiel, we read, "Then he brought me to the gateway of the Lord's house, which faces north. And there I saw the women sitting and wailing for Tammuz." Ezekiel 8 and 14. There they were at the temple wall, still performing the mourning ceremonies, weeping for Tammuz. In 1933, Professor T.H. Robinson wrote of the ceremonial death of Tammuz occurring in Israel, claiming, "This subject has been closely studied in recent years, and it is generally, although not universally, agreed that a ritual involving a dying god, a divine marriage, and a ceremonial procession was found in Israel." In 1958, Professor Windengren stated that we are thus able to assert that there was just such a ritual mourning in Israel as there was in Mesopotamia after the death of Tammuz, and that this lamentation festival was celebrated in connection with the Feast of Booths after the jubilation ceremonies of the sacred marriage. Castrated gods and eunuch priests. It is possible that in certain areas, one of the substitute rituals that initially replaced the actual death of the temporary king was the act of castration, perhaps the actual origin of the Freudian fantasy fear. The severing of the male genitals appeared in several legends that announced the deposition of the ruling male. These accounts occur in the same general areas that also report the death of the male consort, and in some, such as Osiris and Attis, castration and death are closely intertwined. Indo-European Hittite mythology related in the story of Kumarbi, who wrested the position of power from the previous reigning god Anu, that Kumarbi castrated Anu as Kumarbi ascended to the superior rank. Greek mythology, probably borrowing from these earlier Hittite stories, told of Kronos castrating his father Uranus and usurping his position at the suggestion of his mother, the goddess Gaia. Kronos then feared that his son might do the same to him, thus setting off a series of Greek mythological events in which the son Zeus did eventually overthrow his father. Both the Hittite and the Greek stories are Indo-European. Castration may have been the original Indo-European solution to the ritual regicide. The Anatolian myth of the goddess Inanna revealed that once a man slept with the goddess, presumably the high priestess, he might never again sleep with another woman, for fear that he would transfer the sacred powers of the goddess to her. One Attis legend explained his voluntary castration as a reaction to his fear of being unfaithful to the goddess. If the consort was not allowed to have sexual relations with anyone after he had been with the high priestess, castration may have been the solution that at first allowed him to remain alive. When the body of Osiris was cut into 14 pieces by Set, sometimes depicted as a wild boar, Isis repaired it, patiently rejoining all the mutilated sections. But according to the Egyptian myth, the genitals were irrevocably lost, eaten by the fish of the river Nile. Uranus's genitals were incidentally also cast into the waters. The Anatolian Attis appears to have castrated himself in a feverish fit of love, religion, fear of infidelity, shame, or self-punishment, depending on the version of the story. The loyal helpers and attendants in the legends of Ishtar and Inanna were described as eunuchs. The element of castration appears in many ancient accounts of the goddess religion. Repeated references were made to the presence of eunuch priests in ancient Sumer, Babylon, Canaan, and most especially in Anatolia, where classical texts report that the number of such men serving in the religion of the goddess at that time was as high as 5,000 in certain cities. The eunuch priests in Anatolia of classical times actually called themselves Attis. Suggestions have been put forth to explain the evident willingness of these men to castrate themselves, a custom we may find somewhat astonishing today. These explanations are supported by the appearance all through the Near East of representations of priests in female clothing. The costume eunuch priests are said to have worn. Stylianos Alexou writes, the priests and musicians wearing long feminine robes fall into a special category. This practice has led to the surmise that, perhaps owing to Syrian influence, there existed companies of eunuch priests in the Cretan palaces. During a later period, the eunuch priests of Cybele and Attis in Asia Minor formed a similar class. It seems quite possible that as men began to gain power, even within the religion of the goddess, they replaced priestesses. They may have initially gained this right by identifying with and imitating the castrated state of the son/lover, or in an attempt to imitate the female clergy, which originally held the power. They may have tried to rid themselves of their maleness by adopting the ritual of castration and the wearing of women's clothing. Crazy. In Anatolia and even in Rome, after a young male devotee of the goddess had taken the sacred knife to his own body, he then ran through the streets, still holding the severed parts. He eventually flung these into a house along the way, custom decreeing that the inhabitants of that house should provide him with women's clothing, which he wore from that time on. G.R. Taylor, in his abridgment of Brifilt's The Mothers, commented on this custom. He observed that the first step in the limitation of the status of women was to take over from them the monopoly of the religious function. Graves pointed out that the king was often privileged to deputize for the queen, but only if he wore her robes. He suggested that this was the system in Sumerian Lagash. In some areas of Anatolia of classical times, eunuch priests appear to have totally gained control of the goddess religion. A large group of eunuch priests accompanied the statue in rites of Cybele when these were first brought into Rome. We may only speculate as to the effect and influence this may have had upon the newly forming Christian religion and the custom of celibacy among the priests, still existent in the canons of the Catholic Church. The laws of the early Hebrews stated that a man without a penis was not to be considered as a member of the congregation. No man whose testicles have been crushed or whose organ has been severed shall become a member of the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy 23:1. It is perhaps significant that the Bible claims that the original covenant that Yahweh made with Abraham was so explicit about the practice of circumcision. It required that it be done to all Hebrew males shortly after birth. Though this has often been explained by writers in contemporary society as having been a preventive health measure against venereal diseases, could it actually have been a means of emphasizing the maleness of the male worshiping Hebrews from the femaleness of those who had joined the goddess? Summary. The castrated and or dying youthful consort, a vestige of the times in which the high priestess held the divine right to the throne, is often ignored or misunderstood by writers who concentrate on one geographical area or one chronological period and fail to examine the gradual transition from the supremacy of the female deity and her priestesses to the eventual suppression and obliteration of those beliefs. At times, the misunderstanding seems astonishingly disconnected from all documentary evidence. In 1964, A. Leo Oppenheim, who in less than 2 lines hastily whisked over the goddess first worshipped in Sumer as the patron deity of written language, then proceeded to spend 5 full pages discussing his theory that the word Istaru was simply a concept that implied fate or life destiny, later personified by men as the goddess Ishtar. He asserted that this in turn explained why the goddess was continually described as the carrier, the fountainhead of the power and the prestige of the king. But the massive evidence makes it clear that Ishtar, as well as other versions of the goddess throughout the Near and Middle East, was described as the fountainhead of the power and prestige of the king, because it was actually required that the king become the sexual consort of the high priestess, incarnation of the goddess on earth, who probably held the rights to the royal throne through matrilineal descent. The custom of ritual regicide disappeared as the patrilineal tribes gained dominance. The numerous copies of the legend of Gilgamesh in various languages may have been used to further this purpose. Permanent hereditary kingship became the rule, and as the male deity gained supremacy, the role of the benefactor of the divine right to the throne was eventually shifted over to him, a concept of the rights of royalty that survives even today. There can be little doubt that the original customs of ritual regicide and the political position of the high priestess presented a major obstacle to the desire of the northern conquerors for a permanent kingship and more total control of government. But a second and perhaps equally vital point of confrontation leads us in the following chapter to a more thorough explanation of the attitudes and cultural patterns that surrounded sex and reproduction in the religion of the goddess, allowing and even encouraging a female kinship system to continue. Okay, so I'm going to take a quick break, grab a bite, and come back. So just stay tuned. Chapter 7 up next, the sacred sexual customs. I might add this one to the sex ed group. All right, shalom. See you back here shortly.